Few principles of clouds, and this is where clouds differ from the kind of mechanistic clock world that most people in decision-making positions feel they have to actually adopt. Interesting case of clock thinking, by the way, applied to, I think, a cloud, is the insane explosion in special needs children, where people are patently happy to define children as being special needs children, with all the effects that may bring, simply because it actually improves the school statistics. Now, that pursuit of numerical values in education has patently had an extraordinary perverting effect. That is absolutely the application of a clock thinker to a cloud world. Education is a spectacularly complex thing to assess, and the idea that actually you have financial and other metrics which are sort of determined in a formulaic way is going to lead to some catastrophic results. Perverse incentives is another phrase. A great example of perverse incentives, more amusing than today's in the Times about special needs children, was France in the, I think, 18th century, where they decided there was a massive squirrel problem. So they introduced, as clock thinkers, they introduced a bounty for squirrels' tails. So if you brought in a squirrel's tail, you were paid 15 sous as a bounty for supposedly killing a squirrel. What they never understood is the amount they paid went up year on year, and the problem never seemed to go away. It was only when they discovered that cunning Frenchmen had started intensive squirrel farming with massive squirrel breeding programs in order to sell the tails that they realized that actually this clock solution needed a bit of adjustment. But anyway, clouds aren't quite the same as clocks. In some respects, they're worse or more annoying or more frustrating. In some respects, they're much, much more rewarding. Obliquity is an interesting one. Anybody involved in the advertising business knows that actually simply using argument and rational persuasion is counterintuitive. It's one of the reasons why dealing with people is so spectacularly frustrating. Because actually, if you want to get them to do things, you may have to employ reverse psychology, oblique psychology. This is my first book recommendation of the day, a book by John Kay called Obliquity. But the point of that is actually that there's a huge danger in dealing with something like human psychology, that a kind of obviousness, a mechanistic solution is adopted. One of the ones that's being debated now is welfare. It's a very logical clock solution. If you have people who are poor, give them regular injections of small amounts of money. What seems to be the case is actually, whereas that is the perfectly logical, non-oblique way to solve that problem, it doesn't solve the problem. That actually giving people regular but very small, trivial drips of money is probably a pretty good way of guaranteeing people stay poor. There are hundreds of examples Kay gives in this book where actually the indirect pursuit of a goal is more successful, including that point that the greatest companies are not actually the greediest companies. They're those companies which have some other higher ideal which unites everybody behind them, rather than just narrowly pursuing one single kind of scalar interest. It's a tremendous book because all cloud things, all things like social behaviour, are effectively too complicated for absolutely direct intervention. Seduction is the opposite of persuasion in many respects. Persuasion is the clock approach to changing someone's mind. Seduction is the cloud approach. It's nearly always extraordinarily oblique. If you think about it, there is a direct form of, there are people who pursue the direct, non-oblique form of approach to the opposite sex, but it's technically called sexual harassment. The trick is entirely about oblique behaviour, which is making the other person believe that they've chosen to do whatever it is you want them to do. This is why the Viz comic book character, Mr. Logic, is actually comic, because he's an example of non-oblique behaviour applied to an oblique world. His chat-up line is actually, would you care to exchange some genetic material with me? I have a moderately large penis. And it doesn't work. But it's a very interesting point that obliquity is an extraordinarily useful concept. In other words, in order to solve this problem, all our instincts tell us to pursue it in the shortest possible route. Actually, are you better off tacking towards it from some other direction? Will you make more progress actually pursuing something indirectly? Next thing, counterintuitiveness. Now again, a vital thing in human behaviour, which is completely the opposite of what you'd expect. These things Is it a speed camera? One of my small successes of a Spectator article, which will endear me to the drivers among you, is I was instrumental in getting the speed camera more or less banned in the UK, at least the introduction of further ones, because I argued, having read the book Nudge, that actually, based on some statistics I'd seen, these things, which flash your speed at you, they occasionally, the new ones, actually show a smiley face if you're going within the speed limit, and a frowny face if you're going too fast. The extraordinary thing with those things is they cost about 10% of the annual running cost of one of those, but they prevent twice as many accidents. Now that is a case of completely counterintuitive human behaviour not responding to incentives or disincentives actually responding in exactly the opposite direction to that you'd expect. In other words, something that's actually highly punitive has a worse net effect than something that appeals to someone's better nature. But that actually is a hugely important finding for many, many government programmes. What is it we can do that appeals to better nature? I think possibly the reason for this might be this inspires in most of us a naughty boy mentality, which is the second I'm past those stripes in the road, I'm back up to 90, you bastard. Whereas this actually does make some sort of moral appeal to our nature and to our decency. But the fact that actually the right-hand side is better than the left is an incredibly important discovery, because how rarely are those two alternatives tested? And if you look at most government action works by trying compulsion first. And that seems to me, an interesting lesson, which is we always assume that obviously if compulsion doesn't work, then there's no point in trying persuasion. Now to the advertising industry, that seems to be an extraordinarily important discovery, that actually persuasion can work better than compulsion and the threat of punishment, if the psychology is right. So that's our job. This is an example, again, that's a cloud solution. It's not someone, that is the example of someone who thinks that humans are like clocks. This actually acknowledges the cloudiness of it all. Path dependency, decision-making in cloudiness is hugely context-specific. In other words, when we make a decision, what we don't do is perform a kind of cost-benefit analysis of the consequences, long-term and short-term, of either of two decisions, and then pursue the better one. What we seem to do is we're hugely biased in the decision we take by how pleasant or otherwise is the first step on any particular course of action. Okay? So the first step is what disproportionately affects us. Now, if you look at the relations between the sexes, what you'll see is that women are famously considered more keen to get married than men are. Now, is that actually true? Actually, evidence suggests that men are better off getting married than women are. They actually live longer when they're married, when women don't. But what might explain this extraordinary bias is the nature in the West of a wedding, which is the most extraordinarily female 6 weeks of your life that you'll ever be forced to undergo as a man. It's basically a torture test for the Y chromosome. Everything men hate doing, which is choosing colours, doing table plans, discussing the bridesmaids' dresses, it will involve food, buying jewellery, practically nothing, and the entire list of activities that men actually enjoy doing is involved in wedding planning. It's effectively sheer hell. If you look at it, by the way, any men here recently got married, when you compiled that wedding list, each of you did the same thing, didn't you? You tried to put something on, like an Xbox. Okay? No, you can't do that. So every single wedding present is basically a female implement of some kind. It's got things that are ruched, or words like pelmet or something like that, suddenly start getting used. And we're way outside our comfort zone. And it occurred to me, if you actually reframed that so that whatever marriage was like, a wedding was actually a highly male affair where you spent the time basically quad biking and being bought consumer electronics, then most blokes would be desperate to get married and complaining that their girlfriends lack commitment. But the first step of any course of action has a disproportionate effect. This is why in the digital world, interface design is so insanely disproportionately potent as a means of doing anything. I discovered this early on in direct marketing. When we did a test for BT, BT was very keen that everybody responded to any direct mail or any communication by phone and phone only. And we said, well, this may actually reduce response a bit, so we better test it. So we did 3 identical letters offering an identical product and identical price to effectively identical audiences selected at random from a database. The only things that differed were in letter 1, you could only respond by phone, letter 2, you could only respond by post, and letter 3, you could respond by whichever one you preferred. The response rates were as follows, and this is kind of weird when you think about it. Post, 3%, phone only, 1.5%, post and phone, 4.4%, which is practically the sum total of the other two. Which suggests that actually the most important thing in whether you buy that product isn't what the product is or whether you want it, but the means by which you can order it. Now, those of you, I've seen this repeatedly, one most extraordinary and most valuable discovery we've made in this is that we'd assumed for 15 to 20 years in marketing that young people don't give to charity very much. And we'd post-rationalise it away. Oh, they haven't got much money, they think their parents should give, they think it's a problem of government, you know, they don't believe in it, etc., etc., etc. And then we discovered that actually, if you allow young people to give to charity by text message, they actually become quite generous. That actually was nothing to do with the actual action, it was the mode they were required to adopt to effect the action. Now, I think this is a hugely important insight. What I'd like to see the advertising agency become in the next 10 to 20 years is effectively this entity which translates human understanding and a proper understanding of human behaviour in its fullest form into business advantage for the clients. And sometimes that means doing what we conventionally call advertising, but sometimes it'll be about interface design, usability experiments, or anything else, wherever actually the best return comes. Now, I've got an example here. This place, Bristol Parkway, just an example, station. If you want people to take the train more and to drive less, it suddenly occurred to me one day that the worst thing you can ever allow someone to do is make that decision when they're already in their car in the morning. Because then it's an asymmetrical decision. It's, do I stay in my car listening to this enjoyable radio programme and drive all the way to work? Or do I get out of the car, park up, pay to park, walk to the station, buy a ticket, get on a train and go to work? Okay? Now, once you're in the car, the railway has basically lost. No chance. However, theoretically, if you could move that decision back by 10 hours, so that you had a pricing mechanism which meant that actually you basically saved 10% on all rail journeys if you booked them the day before, suddenly the decision is being taken from some distance. So you're not comparing now with future, you're comparing two different futures. If you do a thought experiment, if you imagine you live next to a railway station, okay, and your car, because of lack of parking, you could only park 4 stations down the line, most of the time I think you get on the train and stay there. You wouldn't get off the train and start driving to work. And so if you can actually change that so it's about two futures rather than maintain present or change present, I think the train will come out much better in that decision because the frame of reference has been changed. So maybe what you need to do, if you're a railway company, is you need to incentivise earlier booking and earlier consideration of tomorrow, shall I take the train or shall I drive? Because if you leave it to the following morning, you've lost. Another good incentive, by the way, would be that you could pre-book parking at railway car parks. This place should really be called Bristol Nowhere to fucking Parkway. I don't know if you've been there, but it's absolutely dire. It's called Parkway, and yet all the car parking spaces have gone by 9:15. So Parkway is a little bit of a misnomer. But if you allow those things to be pre-bookable, suddenly you've got a little incentive which says, I need to think about this now. So the decision people will make, some people call this inconsistency. It isn't actually, because as various philosophers have made the point, since you can only make one decision at any one time, and since actually any decision is simply according to the information available to you at that moment, to make two decisions at two different times is, don't ask me here, Ludwig von Mises makes the claim that to say, I prefer champagne to cider and I prefer cider to beer, but I prefer beer to champagne, is not an inconsistent statement. Now, I can't quite get my head around that either, but anyway, it might help you with this.